The Grandest Bookshop in the World by Amelia Miller. Over the week, something awful moved into Valley's brain. However hard he tried to kick it out, it always crept back in, like a rat. He tried to starve it, but it was a keen little scavenger. It kept finding errant thoughts and odd details. Pa's limp, the rasp with he told the little girl's bedtime story, a crack in the plaster, a fraying reading chair. The more of these it gobbled, the stronger it grew. By Thursday, the thing was trapped in his skull, too large to ignore. It was a theory, and his theory was this. Pa was coming down with something, and so was the arcade. Not the business, not the management of the shop. The book arcade itself was ill, and Pa was affected by the same condition. How? He didn't know. Cole's book arcade was suffused with so much of Pa's passion and energy, and enhanced by so many of his carefully written spells, that it did seem to have a mind of its own. But a building still didn't have organs or cells. Its skeleton was brick. Its inside was bright and dry. Valley could not have defended his theory if anyone had challenged him. Then again, plenty of sicknesses of the mind were yet to be explained by science. And Valley had found plenty of evidence that his idea, strange as it may have been, was true. The rainbow sign at the entrance needed repainting. It was usually the brightest thing on Burke Street. But as Valley jumped off the tram from school, the rainbow looked a little drab. The 7 stripes had been touched up just before Christmas, but it seemed the summer sun had bleached the sign faster than usual. The little men were out of time. The 2 mechanical sailor dolls worked at the mouth of the arcade, day and night. Powered by a water wheel, they rotated a set of metal signs that beckoned customers in. The rhythm of the flipping signs was as familiar to Valley as his own pulse. But by Thursday, they had lost their beat. It was supposed to go, reading and thinking, bring wisdom. Clink! Welcome to Cole's Book Arcade. Clink! Instead, the little men tried, tired. Federation is coming. Clink. 2 million books. Clink. The pause was long enough that some customers were walking down the southern side of Burke Street without hearing the clink. If they didn't hear the clink, they didn't look around for what made it. If they didn't look around, they didn't realize that they were passing Cole's Book Arcade. And if they didn't see Cole's Book Arcade, they didn't come in. Other troubling details added weight to the theory. A shelf in the ornament department collapsed, shattering the merchandise. The lift got stuck for half an hour with a throng of customers inside, and some of them shouted at the poor lift driver. A lamp plummeted through the light well from the very top of the 2nd floor in the middle of the night. Luckily, otherwise it could have killed someone. All the while, Pa was going to bed early. He was still limping a little from the fall in the fernery and leaned heavily on railings. And within Valley's theory lurked another, scarier thought. What if Pa never got better the way Ruby hadn't? He did his best to hide his feelings. Eddie and Linda would say he was being silly. The little girls didn't need to be frightened. By Thursday afternoon, a kind of grim acceptance had taken hold of him. If the problem could be solved, Ma and Pa would solve it. If it couldn't, it was out of Valley's hands. He decided to spend no more time worrying over the things he could not change. All things from mountains to species to people, rose and fell in their time. And this problem, one way or another, would pass. He would be calm. He would be level-headed. He would go and find something interesting to read. "What's the matter with you?" demanded Pearl, when he passed her on the first floor. Valley looked up. The constant irritation was teetering on a ladder, armed with a butterfly net. At the top of the bookshelf, the Willy Wagtail surveyed the arcade like an emperor. "Nothing," he said. "Val." She fixed him with a hard, steady look. "Have you seen your face?" Annoyance prickled at him like an itch. "You wouldn't understand." "Tell me anyway. Why would I do that?" "Well, why do you talk to Ebenezer? He doesn't understand you." "Because he still listens," Valley said, and then realized that Pearl, in her own way, was offering to do the same. Maybe he was underestimating her. Linda was as old to him as he was to Pearl, and Valley didn't like the condescension from her either. Pearl wasn't a baby anymore. She'd seen Pa fall in the fernery, and she'd said she had met the mysterious visitor. Whatever was going on, she knew something about it. Valley fortified himself with a deep breath. "I think our book arcade is sick." He braced for the dismissive laughter, but it didn't come. Pearl only frowned. "Has it started sneezing or something?" "No," Valley admitted, "but things have been, well, strange. With the lift breaking down and everything, and Pa sounds like has a cold." Eddie would have snorted and said something like, "Strange? Our arcade? You didn't say!" Pearl did not. "You're saying that the lift broke down and the china shelf fell because Pa is ill? Or the other way around?" "Pa fell because the arcade is ill? It sounds like twaddle," said Valley quickly. I don't think it's twaddle." Pearl pushed against the bookshelf, rolling her ladder along its railings. "I think that's quite a observation. Sagacious? Is that how you say it?" She shrugged. "Anyway, it makes sense. Pa sort of is the arcade, if you think about it." "How does that make any sense?" Pearl gestured broadly. "It's like all the different parts of his personality. He loves music, he loves nature, he loves books and art and different cultures. And us!" Valley looked around at the hundreds of thousands of books, all around the first floor. They were stacked on shelves and packed in drawers and standing in towels. Pa didn't know an awful lot about an astonishing array of topics. The wagtail looked about and fluttered down to a nearby reading chair. Pearl tiptoed down the ladder. "So, you believe me?" asked Valley. "I do." She tightened her grip on the butterfly net. "It's all the obscure Smith's fault. I think Pa took one of his astonishing deals." Now she was the one talking, twaddle. "Who's Obscure Smith?" "Obscure Smith, Valley, the man from the other night." Pearl was as intent as a cat on the wagtail as it preened its paper feathers. "And when I catch the spy of his, I'll burn it." She lunged at the wagtail, her net swooping down to trap it. It dived from the chair, somersaulted, and darted out of sight. Pearl popped up on her toes, and to look over the railings, the bird was gone. "Oh, bum! Who is he?" Valley asked. "Pa says he sells things you can't buy with money. Things like dreams and wishes." She swished her butterfly net to and fro. "He's very tall, and he has a little beard, and a walking stick." but it's secretly a magic wand, and he wears tails during the day. Hang on, tails? Not a real tail, you donkey, a tailcoat? Valley's last hope that she was making all of it up deserted him. So you can wish for £1,000,000? You could. Pearl brushed some dust off her skirt. But Pa says you have to give something precious in return. Like selling your soul to the devil. Exactly like that, said Pearl. Or Rumpelstiltskin. Valley looked around at the colorful spines of the books. He saw the rainbows shining down from the balcony above, the sparkle of brass and glass all around the arcade. The realization landed on his shoulders, as heavy and cold as a sack full of stones. Oh no. Oh yes, said Pearl. The arcade was their home. It was their neighborhood and their playground. The joy and passion of their father's enormous heart was woven into the reading chairs, buried in the wood, grain of the shelves. Protectiveness surged up within Valley. Pa can't give the arcade away. What could he wish for? Good question, said Pearl. Let's ask him. And before Valley could protest, his sister was striding away between the bookshelves, her butterfly net like a spear on her shoulder. Pa wasn't in his office. He wasn't in the flat. Even Mr. Pike, the manager who had worked with Pa for more than 20 years, hadn't seen him all afternoon. Pearl insisted on searching all the back rooms. By now, the arcade was awash with the sunset glow and gaslight. Hunger nagged at Valley as he climbed over a broken cabinet in the back room on the first floor. Maybe Pearl had fooled him after all, and this was just an elaborate game of make-believe. Obscurismith wasn't a real word. Nothing was in the back rooms but boxes of dead stock and a few chairs, worn and vandalized. He was about to suggest that they return to the flat when Pearl, with a cry, knocked down a stack of pamphlets. What have you done now? His sister didn't reply. He heard her shallow breathing, the slap of the pamphlet sliding to the floor. Pearl? Valley struggled through the dusty chairs. What happened? He pushed through the piles of old paper towards the sound. There was his sister pulling herself up, and there was his other sister. She was lying in the cot that each of them had slept in when they were little. Her bare feet just touched the end. She had dark curly hair like Ma's. Her cheeks were smooth as porcelain. Her eyes were open. She was pale and still, except for her breathing. It felt like reaching the top of a tree and hearing the branch crack underneath him. Like a light bulb coming on his chest, only to shatter. Ruby was dead. Ruby was 3 years dead and buried. She had died with the rash all over her, and what must lie in her grave did not bear thinking about. This was a bad dream, a hole in time, a desperate hallucination of his grieving mind. And still, Valley reached out to touch her. She would vanish. She would turn to dust. But he missed her so much. His fingers met the solid flesh of her face. She was cold, so cold it burned, like a steel rail on a winter morning. Valley pulled back. This was no nightmare. It was worse. The experience was real, and Ruby wasn't. She hadn't moved, not to look at him, nor at Pearl. Her chest was rising and falling, but the rhythm was wrong. She didn't pause between one breath and the next, and he remembered the bittersweet, lilting tune to What Our Ruby Did, which Pa had written for the day she went to her last party in her fairy costume. She danced like a fairy, she sang like a frog, she buzzed like a bee, she dashed like a dog. The song had no verse for this quiet, still thing. Who's there? It was Pa's voice, hoarse and angry, which was so unlike him that Pearl and Valley both froze. He came out of a supply cupboard in the back of the storeroom, with a blanket over his shoulder and 2 more in his arms. You kids aren't supposed to play in... He met Valley's eyes and stopped dead. We're sorry, Pa, Pearl said. We'll look for you everywhere. Their Pa half leaned half against a cabinet, bracing himself on the edge of it. He drew in a long, shuddering breath, dust whirled in the air. Somewhere downstairs, a child squealed with laughter. No, darling, I ought to be sorry. He glanced again at the quiet, false daughter, breathing mechanically in the cot. It serves me right for thinking this time would be different. Valley was trying not to lose his temper. He didn't like fighting. He didn't like the monkey inside that made him want to ball fists and bare teeth. That left him feeling ashamed and stupid and afterwards tasting bitterness, but the shock of seeing Ruby only to have it torn away again made him feel like someone was playing a cruel joke on him. His voice, when he spoke to his father, was harsher than he meant it to be. What is this? Pa gave him a long look, as if he would only speak when everybody was ready to be rational. That only stoked Valley's fire. How dare he? Ruby wasn't just another gimmick, another stunt to make people spend their money. How do you do this? Why do you do this? Why would you do this? Pearl went to their father and put her arms around his waist. I know you miss her, but she's not for our arcade, Pearlie. His voice was soft. I thought if it worked, then Valley wondered with a jolt of alarm. If his father was about to cry, as far as the children knew, Pa had cried exactly once, when he was writing out the Ruby song to put in a new edition of Cole's Funny Picture Book. Even then, only Linda had seen. But Pa didn't break down. He took out his hanky and gave it to Pearl. Why don't we go down to the office and have some of our best China tea? Valley didn't want tea. He wanted answers. He wanted the cot gone, and the fake Ruby with it, and the arcade to go back to flourishing, and his father to be bright and quick and weird again. Fear and uncertainty belonged to the outside world. Home was meant to be safe and happy, a place where solving a problem was as simple as finding the right book. But Pearl nodded and leaned against Pa, hiding her face from the thing in the cot. Go downstairs, he patted her back. I'll be there in a minute. He gave Valley a meaningful look. Time to be the big brother and shepherd, Pearl downstairs. How frustrating. Valley lingered at the storeroom door, making sure their father was really following. He didn't come right away. Instead, he spread the blankets over the copy of Ruby. He stroked her forehead the way he did when any of the children were unwell. He reached over and closed the storybook, which Valley hadn't noticed before, on a crate beside the bed. There you are, dear girl. I'll be back at bedtime. The copy did not move. Chapter 5. An astonishing deal. Down in Pa's office, the clock ticked loudly. The waitresses brought the teapot and cups right to the door. China tea wasn't sweet, but it was aromatic and soothing. Pa's care in pouring it made Pearl feel right to trust him, even though her brother was sitting with his arms crossed and his lips pressed hard together. She felt she was on the edge of understanding. The tale of the red monkey and the clever bird was pressing at her mind. The red monkey fell through the tree. The other monkeys missed her. Then the old monkey met a bird who said he could bring her back. Pearl had what her mother would have called a brainwave. As Pa sat down, Pearl fixed him with fresh attention. Valley was right. Pa wasn't well, and nor was the arcade, and it all pointed to the long-legged men who wore evening clothes in the daylight. Pearl knew her father was putting off speaking about the thing in the cot. She could tell by how he kept glancing away that he was ashamed of it, or perhaps he was ashamed that he had tried to protect his children from seeing it and failed. Pearl decided to be brave. Pa, she put down her teacup. That little bird in your story, you were talking about the obscure Smith, weren't you? Pa looked up, alarmed and a touch guilty. I know, I shouldn't have peeked at his card the other day, but I did, Pearl said, and since he's been watching me with his paper bird, and since you said he sells impossible things, I've been wondering what he sold you, and now I know. You made a deal with the obscure Smith to bring Ruby back. Her father frowned. Well, when you put it like that, they go wrong, don't they? Pearl said, sitting up a bit straighter. She was hitting her stride now. His deals, he gets what he wants, and it goes wrong for the other person. Pa sat back in his chair, his fingertips touching his beard. Then in a halting, gentle voice he began. In the old days of Paddy's Market, you had to have a good head on your shoulders. You'd meet a fellow who said he had a horse with its tail where its head should be, and you'd say to yourself, well, there's something I haven't seen. So you'd pay your penny and pull back the curtain. And what did you find? Just an old nag standing backwards in the store with its rump in the trough. This brought the tiny smile from Valley, but he didn't uncross his arms. Across the way was a lady who said her ointment would make a man look young again. Pa was taking a while to get to the point, but Pearl didn't mind. She liked his stories. You'd take home the ointment, put it on your face, and it made you look young, all right? Your beard would all fall out, and you'd have a face as bold as a baby's. So after a few years selling pies and books in a place like that, I thought I knew every trick of the trade. And then he turned up. The obscure Smith? Pa nodded. He asked me to call Magnus Maximilian, but that sounded like a stage name to me. He liked to introduce himself that way. Never. My name is, but call me such and such. He struck me as friendly, charming, even, but he seemed to consider himself not above the rest of us. Exactly. Perhaps a little off to the side. Valley shifted in the seat. How do you mean? Well, the rest of us, all the shopkeepers, got our lunches and suppers at one store or another. But I never saw him eat a thing. He didn't seem to have any regular customer, but he had plenty who wanted a refund. They didn't intend to ask him for one either. They demanded, they begged, or they would have if they had been able to find him. I tried to help them when I could, but he had a way of disappearing just when you wanted him, and nobody was more miserable than the people who found him in the end. Why? Asked Pearl. He didn't give refunds, said Pa, only exchanges. If you didn't like the first deal and managed to find him, he'd swap it for something worse. Valley fixed his father with a critical squint. And you thought you could trust a person like that? I shouldn't have. Pa dragged his hand down his face, but I couldn't refuse. No one else could have done it. Done what? Double-crossed you? Valley demanded. Pa closed his eyes hard, and Pearl didn't hear what he said next. I wanted her back in time for Easter. Pearl glared at her brother. He didn't look away. I know you older ones don't care much about Easter anymore, Val, but it's still exciting for your little sisters. Pa's voice was getting shaky again. She used to love all the new clothes and dyeing the eggs with vegetable skins and the games at the church theater. Don't forget the chocolate, said Pearl, afraid that Pa might break down if he tried to keep talking about Ruby. The chocolate is very exciting for us. The distraction worked. Pa looked at her with that familiar mustache quirk that meant a smile. Anyway, I don't know what became of Mr. Maximilian when they rebuilt Old Patty's. When I moved down to Cole's Cheap Books, Bill Pike and I had our hands full. I thought the old fox had moved out to North Melbourne or somewhere, and that was the end of that. North Melbourne? Probably barracks for the shinboners, said Valley snubbly. He went for the Melbourne Redlegs. Wait a minute. Something about all this, Pearl realized, didn't add up. And it wasn't the idea of the strange man hollering for the shinboners at the football. How old was Mr. Pike when you worked at Paddy's Market again? About 13 when he started, I think. And how old was the obscure smith? 30, I thought. But that was 22 years ago. The obscure smith looks younger than Mr. Pike. And if you didn't talk to him in all that time, how did he find out about us? Us, as in the book arcade. No, us, Pearl gestured at herself and Valley. Your children. He knew how Ruby passed, and he knew Linda was the oldest. We're in the picture book, Valley said. All those problems with our names in them. Pearl imagined the obscure smith cross-legged poring over Pa's funny picture book. If it were any other grown-up, that thought would have made her laugh. With the obscure smith, though, it seemed to add his strangeness, as if he didn't know the proper ways to behave or didn't care. He truly seemed glad to see me, Pa continued. Told me he'd been traveling the world, and in all that time, he'd never seen anything quite like our arcade. He mentioned your manners, Pearl, and how noble that I kept the read for as long as you liked sign in such a grand building, and how nice for Melbourne to have such a unique attraction. At that, Pa looked immeasurably sad. I did think he meant it, you know. I really thought he liked our arcade. It was becoming more difficult for him to speak. When he mentioned Ruby, I knew he was up to something, but I thought I hadn't left any space for him to slither out. He asked for a treasure in place of the one he would give me, and I lost my temper at him. Then he squeezed Pearl's hand. I thought he was after you. A ruby in exchange for a pearl, she shivered. I wrote out the contract, I said. You're not to touch anyone else in my family. You're not to disturb her grave. I don't want my Ruby Roo coming back like Frankenstein's creature. If you can't bring her back alive as hale and hearty as she is in this picture, don't try it out at all. He opened one of his drawers and took out a photograph. It showed Ruby aged around 5, dressed up in her best frilly coat and bonnet. Her dark, curious eyes were looking right at the camera, but because it was a formal picture, she wasn't smiling. Pearl had only been small on the day of the portrait, but she remembered it. The photography studio